Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Mem Vav. We're going to get started with the topic of the blood that we saw in the Mishna. I'm just going back to the Mishna for a quick minute. The Mishna had said there's all sorts of exceptions to the rule that we're not chayav pigul if we eat them, but we are going to be chayav notar and tameh, like the ketoret, the levona, the komets, right? There were all sorts of things that are not things that have a matir, something that enables them. You're not going to be chayav pigul, but you are going to be chayav if it was left over, if it was impure and you ate it, or if you were impure when you ate it, other than dam. Okay, dam is an exception to the rule, and it's going to take us all of Amud Aleph to figure out where they get it from, even though that's really where the Gemara starts with. It's going to take a little while because the Gemara is going to get off on a bit of a side issue. We're going to talk about blood. So we're going to have three different drashot, chutz min adam, and we're going to actually, so this Gemara is going to start here, chutz min adam, minane mile, where do we get this from? And they're going to start to bring three sources. Now, the three sources are not actually telling us about this issue. There's actually a sugya in Me'ilah. And these three psukim are telling you that there's no laws of Me'ilah for blood. What is Me'ilah? That's not what we're talking about here. Me'ilah is misuse of consecrated property. That's if I accidentally misuse something, I'm liable. These three psukim are going to teach you, you're not liable for Me'ilah when it comes to misuse of the blood. If I use the blood for my own purpose, my own benefit, I'm not liable. So it's all going to come from this pasuk. Vayikra Yud Zayin Yud Aleph. Ki nefesh habasar badamhu. Now this is actually a pasuk talking about why you're not allowed to eat blood. Okay, not sacrifices. Why you're not allowed to eat blood in general. Okay, so a nefesh habasar badamhu. Va'ani netativ lachem ala mizbeach. Okay, the nefesh of the meat is the soul of a live being is the blood, and I gave it ani netativ lachem to you ala mizbeach for on the altar lechaper al nafshotechem. God is saying, what's the purpose of blood? I gave you the blood for you. We're going to talk about that word for you in a minute, to atone for your sins on the altar, basically to give you an option for atonement. Ki adam hu b'nefesh yechaper, because the blood in the soul atones. Okay, it's a very hard pasuk to understand. In fact, I strongly recommend, I mentioned it earlier this week, but now it would be really relevant to listen to B'machshava Shniya, Rabbi Yosi Kleimer's shiur, which is now back up. She'll be giving shiurim regularly for us. And it's all about ki adamu hanefesh and why, the blood is so central and why really we can't eat blood and where that comes from and this whole issue of the blood and the significance of the blood, which we've been talking about a lot in sacrifices and we'll continue to talk about. So all different perspectives, okay, on the issue of the blood. So now the Gemara says, Menani Mile, Amar Ula, and again, what they're trying to find out is how do we know about notar and tameh, that the blood is not part of the, right, if you eat the blood, it's not forbidden for notar and tameh. Amar Ula, Amar Kha, Va'ani netativ lachem, shalahem yeh. So the first answer now, again, this isn't the answer yet. We have to wait till we get to how do we get from Me'ilah to Tumah and Notar. But right now they're talking about misuse of consecrated property. So you have blood for a sacrifice. How do you know there's no Me'ilah there? So he says, look at what the pasuk says. Ula says, it says, I gave it to you. What does it mean to you? It's yours. Shalachem yeh. It's for you. Meaning, it's not really sanctified in the sense like other sanctified items, that they're God's. These are for you. Debei Rabbi Ishmael Tana, the house of Rabbi Ishmael says, Amar kra lechapel, lechaparan etativ lo leMe'ilah. I gave it to you to atone, but not for Me'ilah. Okay, they're not exactly opposites. That we say if it's to atone, there's not Me'ilah, but this is the world of drasha. Rabbi Yochanan, and meaning you don't have to be convinced by the logic. It doesn't have to be logical. Rabbi Yochanan Amal. Because you could have just said, I gave it to you to put on the altar. So why do you add that extra word? To exclude something else that it's not. It's not Me'ilah. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kha, who, okay, the word who, okay, that's at the end of the pasuk. Or actually it's at the beginning. Ki nefesh habasar badam hu. Now that's he. I assume they mean at the end. Ki hadam hu banefesh yechaper. Now it could also just say hadam banefesh yechaper. Why does it say who? Who usually comes as a word. Okay, who can come as different things. But who is sometimes used as a word, it's the same status, like you're stable. I mean, you might be, you might not be, but certain things, the idea is Hu is a stability. It remains the same throughout. So now, what's the drasha here? And this is what's going to get us off on our big tangent before we get back to our real topic. Hu lifnei kapara kilachar kapara. Its status before atonement is just like its status after atonement. In other words, its status is always the same. Now, ma'achar kapara. Now, once you've gotten atonement through the blood, once you've achieved atonement, ein bo me'ilah. Why not? Because it's done its mitzvah already. You've used the blood for what you need it for. Whatever's still left is not me'ilah anymore, because it like the me'ilah leaves it, because it's done already. So since when it's done, there's no me'ilah, also in the early stage, there's no me'ilah, even before you get atonement. So now, right, there's a lot of things that, right, the me'ilah, like for example, shlamim, right, before you sprinkle the blood, all the meat's forbidden. Now, and it's me'ilah. After you sprinkle the blood, then the meat is permitted, so there's no me'ilah anymore. Things change. But this one says who, that means that status is not going to change, which means since we know, it's obvious, although that's what we're going to ask, it's obvious that once the mitzvah is done, there's no me'ilah anymore. So therefore, it must be, if the status is always the same, there must be no me'ilah before as well. So now the Gemara is going to say, you could say the reverse. Maybe if, right, the status remains the same, why don't you say, before atonement, the blood is obviously sacred and you can't use it. And therefore, after kapara, since before kapara it has milah, after kapara, maybe it still has milah, maybe it's the opposite direction you want to go in. So they say, and this whole diyun we're going to have now is a parenthetical diyun, because remember, I want you to remember this because we're going to get back. We're looking for a source. How do we know the blood is not applicable for notar and tameh, right? There's no law of karet by eating blood of notar and tameh. And we started with 3 psukim that prove there's no me'ilah in blood. Not our topic, okay? We have to get back there. But right now, we're off on a whole thing about this last question, this last opinion. So they say, it's obvious, because ein lecha davar shenaseh mitzvato mo'alim bo. They say it as if this is a given. There's no such thing that you finish, you complete the mitzvah, and there's still me'ilah. Once the mitzvah is completed, okay, those objects are no longer sanctified to the extent that there's going to be a law of me'ilah, okay? The doraita, if you use it, you're going to have to bring a korban asha me'ilah. So the Gemara says, below, what do you mean? Of course there are. And we're going to show you an example. Harei trumat hadeshen. Okay, so what's trumat hadeshen? Trumat hadeshen is when in the morning, it would be the first thing they would do in the morning. It's not even morning yet. Remember, it's the first avoda that they do before even the sun rises. And they sweep the ashes off the altar. They put it next to the altar on the bottom. Okay, they're at top of the altar. That's where all the ashes are from the previous day's sacrifices. And if you remember, they leave stuff burning overnight, and that's why they come in the morning. They have to clean the mizbeach, basically. And they take the ashes. Okay, it's interesting. The cleaning of the altar becomes a mitzvah. Okay, they take the ashes. They put it next to the altar. In other words, they go down the big ramp of the altar. They put it on the floor next to the altar. There's a specific spot for it. It says in the pasuk, "Visamo etz al hamizbeach." You place it next to the altar. Because it says "Visamo," they learn you have to keep it there. And basically what happens, it ultimately gets absorbed into the ground. Remember, the ground was soil, kind of that kind of floor. It wasn't solid, marble floors or something. So it gets seeped up, or tiles, right? It gets seeped up into the ground, ultimately. You can't use it. You can't benefit from it. Now, the mitzvah is done. The mitzvah is litchomat hadeshen, to do the sweeping and move it there. Once you finish, it's done, but you still can't use it. So there you have an example. So why don't we say, back to our question. So you could say the same thing is true here, and whenever something's mentioned once, we can build a paradigm and learn a binyan av, learn from it to other things. So we say, no, what are the rules? You remember? If there's one thing, you can build a paradigm from there. If there's two, then the Torah specifically said it in 2 places. That means shnei ktuvim aba'im ke'echad ein melamdim. 2 psukim say the same thing. You can't then learn to other things. Okay? Ein melamdim. So we're now going to show there's 2 places where it says this. Now, if you might remember, and we're going to get back to this, there's a machloket. Is it 2 or 3? Some people think 2 could still build a paradigm. Only 3 can't. So right now they say, right, they always start these arguments with, there's 2 places. Then later they get to, well, what if you think 2 is, you could still teach? Well, then they usually find a 3rd, or in this case, we're actually going to have to come up with some other answer, because there is no 3rd. So they answer, Mishum dehave trumat hadeshen ubigdei kehuna. The begadim of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. Now, he wears two different sets of clothing. There's the gold clothes and there's the white ones. The white ones are the same. The gold are the regular Kohen Gadol clothing, but when he does the special avoda in the Kodesh Kodeshim, he does it with the white clothes. And those are just the same as a regular Kohen's garments. Now, there's a big machloket. It says in the pasuk, okay, Uba Haron al Ol Moed, when he's finished with his avoda, he goes to Ol Moed, Pashat et bigdei abad asher lavash. He takes off those white clothing that he was wearing, biva'ol hakodesh, that he wore when he went into the Kodesh Kodeshim, v'hinicham sham, and he places them there. Now, there's a big machloket here. What does that mean? Some people say he places it there, and that's it, like geniza. You can't do anything with them. They're forbidden to benefit forever. So that's the one we're going to talk about right now. So bigdei kuna is another example. The mitzvah is done, and yet they're forbidden. So there's shnei ktuvim be'in ke'echad, v'chol shnei ktuvim be'in ke'echad, ein melamdim. If you have two ktuvim, say that, you can't learn. And that's why we know our answer to our question. You can't say me'ila is after kapara is going to be like before kapara, and it's going to be forbidden because we don't have any paradigm for saying after the mitzvah is done, there's still an isur hana'ah. Oh, we have these two? Well, that's two, and two means just here, nowhere else. And there it's specific because the pasuk said so. So now they're going to obviously say, Hanicha l'Rabbanan, da'amar v'nicham sham, milamed shtunim gniza. The rabbis who darshan a pasuk and say they need gniza, those clothes, so, okay, you've made a good argument according to that. Ela l'Rabbi Dosa, da'amar mutarot hen l'kohen edyot, u'bavad shalei shtamesh b'hem l'yom kippurim achel, fascinating, he holds. You can give them to any other kohen. All other kohenim could wear them. Amazing, that right? These are two very extreme positions. He thinks a regular kohen could wear them. The only thing you can't do is you can't use it another Yom Kippur. The clothes can only go into the Kodesh Kodeshim once and be used on Yom Kippur. After that, they can only be used for regular kohen clothing. This is a machloket we saw in Yoma. Actually, it appears in a bunch of other sugya. So Ma'i Kalamemer. So according to that opinion, what are you going to say? So they say, okay, we found another one. So we have Trumat Hadeshen, the sweeping of the ashes, and Egla Arufa. What does it say by Egla Arufa? If you remember, that's the ceremony when someone dies in between two cities and we're not sure who killed, so we measure the closest city and then we say, right, we have to atone for somebody murdered this person and we don't know who. So they break the back of a calf. And it says, Arfu Sham et Egel. Okay, they go to a Nachal Eitan. Without going into all the details, it says, and they did it there. There means, they darshan, Sham Tehei Kvurato. You have to bury it right there. Things that need geniza, that can't be used anymore, that you can't benefit from, you bury them. So, there you have it. This is a case where it was done already. They did the mitzvah, and yet it's still forbidden. So now you have that Shnei Ktuvim Habein Ke'echad, V'chol Shnei Ktuvim Habein Ke'echad, Ein Melamdim. So now, obviously, they're going to ask the question I mentioned earlier, which is, okay, we got two, but that only works if you say two don't teach. If you say two teach and you need three, so what are you going to say there? So instead of saying we have a third, because they don't have a third, I mean, you do have a third if you include the big dekuna of the rabbi's position, but we just said we want to know what if you don't take that position. So they answer, Trei mi'ute ktive. Both in Egla Rufa and in the Trumat Hadeshen, there's a word that makes it appear that it's just this case, that there's a limitation. The law we're talking about here, that there's still going to be Me'ila, is only here. And then the other one, it's only here. So then you can't learn from there to anywhere else. So what is that? Hachaktiv ha'arufa. Okay, they call, this is not the strongest drasha, okay, but after the egel is killed and after it's the egla rufa is killed and they say arfu sham, where it says, okay, you have to bury it, and the whole ceremony is done, it then says that all ziknei ha'ira hayi akrovim el hachalal hakrovim el hachalal yirchetzu et yedehem al ha'egla ha'arufa banachal. They wash their hands on the egla, that's whose back, whose neck was broken. They call it ha'arufa. So why do you use the extra ha'yidiyah? You didn't really need it. It's to say this is unique, just this one, because right, when you use the word the, ha, it's saying this stands out, and therefore you can't learn from there to anything else. Visamo. It could have just said visam etzel hamizbeach. It says visamo, put it. So it means it and nothing else. It's going to have the laws of me'ilah. Okay. So that was a whole aside just because of the third pasuk we brought for the blood relating to the issue of me'ilah. Now we have to get back to our issue. Okay, we wanted to say, are you sure it's that way? Why are you going just like after kapara, there's no me'ilah? How do you know, right? And therefore, before kapara, there's no me'ilah. Now, they tried to suggest maybe it's the reverse. And then they say that's because there's no such thing. And after, you're going to have still laws of me'ilah after you finish the mitzvah. And, oh yeah, we have some examples, but don't learn from those because those are exceptions. Okay, now, or it's either shni ktuvim, or it specifically has exceptions in the wording there. Now we have to get back to our topic. So, tlat akrai bedam lamali. Now, sometimes they bring a lot of different psukim and there's different opinions, but sometimes they say, well, there seem to be 3 psukim saying the same thing. So it's true, like this one brought that as their proof pasuk, this one brought that, this one brought that. But here it just seems weird that we have 3 psukim by me'ilah. They're all trying to say there's no laws of me'ilah by blood. So, why do we have 3? Finally we get to our answer. Lemi'ute mi me'ilah, mi notar umi tuma. So even though these were all saying there's no me'ilah, we're now going to say, well, there's 3. Must be one is for me'ilah, one is for notar, one is for tuma. Now what's missing? Pigul. So the Gemara has to just tell you, Aval pigul lo tzarich krai. You don't need a pasuk for pigul to say there's no laws of pigul by the blood. If you eat the blood, you won't be chayav if the korban was pigul. Ditznan, because that we already know from a Mishna. It doesn't fit the criteria for pigul. So we don't need a pasuk to tell us. Because kol sheyesh lo mitirim, bein adam, bein lo mizveh, chayvim ala mishum pigul. But dam gufei matiru. The dam is the matir. It's what permits other things, but nothing permits the blood to be sprinkled on the altar. So that's why the blood is out for pigul, and you don't need a pasuk for it. So anyway, we got to our answer. One of those 3 psukim goes for the tameh, and one of them goes for notar, and that's how we resolve. I'm a Rabbi Yochanan. If we're already in this topic of 3 psukim that teach, that come to bring these some limitation here. The 3 psukim are teaching the same thing. What are they teaching us? So comes Rabbi Yochanan, and he says, Shlosha kritut b'shlamim lamali. And this isn't just here because it happens to be a similar thing. And that's really why it's here. But it also relates to topics we've been discussing. And topic of our Mishna of Tumah. So it says you're going to get karet in 3 different psukim in Vayikra. Okay, one is in Vayikra Kaf Bet, Pasuk Gimel, where basically it's going to say in all 3 psukim, if you do something tameh relating to sacrifices, okay, which, and maybe they're talking about different ones, we'll see. Kol isha sheyikrav ela kodeshim v'tumato alav. I'm skipping a few of the words. V'tumato alav v'nechrita nefesh hayimi lefanai. Now, all of them are talking about shlamim. Okay? So why shlamim? It's the most obvious to talk about not eating impure meat, or if you're impure, don't eat the meat, because the shlamim is the one that the majority, right? The owners eat, everybody eats the shlamim. As opposed to the chata and the yasham, which are just for the kohen. The ola, none of the meat gets eaten. Now, of course, you're going to be chayav if you eat those meats. Also, if they're impure. But the main topic, it's mentioned in the shlamim, because that's the one that most people eat the meat of. So, in Vayikra Kaf Bet Gimel, it says, if you go, yikrav ala kodeshim, v'tumato alav, v'nechrita nefesh hayimi lefanai. Okay, we've seen all these psukim. Then it says, in Perek Zayin Pasuk Kaf, and then also in Kaf Aleph, it also says karet about tuma. Nefesh asher tochal basar mi basar zevachim. Asher tochal basar mi zevachim asher laHashem v'tumato alav v'nechrita nefesh himeyameha. Again, tuma is on you. Karet. Next pasuk v'nefesh ki tiga b'chol tamei v'achal mi basar zevachim asher laHashem v'nechrita nefesh hayi. Okay, 3 pasukim that really seem to be saying the same thing. So Rabbi Yochanan says, what are these 3 psukim coming to say? Turning now to Amud Bet. Echad leklal ve'echad leprat. Okay, 2 of them are there to teach you this klal uprat. So Rashi helps us out here and explains what are we talking about. Well, the way we want to darshan it right now is davar shahaya bichlal v'yatsa min haklal lelamed. In other words, there was something that was grouped with everything else, and then there's like an exception where it comes out to say specifically, which is the shlamim. In other words, shlamim was part of the group of korbanot, but then it came out and specifically said this about shlamim. Lo lelamed al atzmo yatsa, ela lelamed al haklal kulo yatsa. So it's not to teach about itself specifically, it's to teach about everything. That's the rule. So from here you're going to get to Shlamim, okay, and they continue to go on. Hanefesh asher tochal basar mi zevach hashlamim. V'halosh shlamim, I'm just in Rashi still, the first Rashi on the Amud. Halosh shlamim bichlal kol hakodeshim hayu. Shlamim were part of all sacrifices. So why did they specifically mention shlamim? La'akish aleim lomar, and to say, okay, where is this chuma? It's specifically mashlamim yuchadim kodshei mizbeach av kol kodshei mizbeach. We're talking about you're going to get karet when it's something. Okay, so either you're impure or the meat is impure. Although that's going to be a question also. Is it the meat? Is it you? But only for sacrificial items, things that go on the altar. Okay, like the meat. It could be even wood that goes on the altar, that burns on the altar. Although we said the wood is. There was a whole machloket about the wood, if you remember, because it's not edible. That was this machloket in the Mishna between Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis, which we're going to get to right now. But anyway, he says, one is klal, one is prat, that this applies basically to everything that's similar to shlamim, which is anything that goes on the altar. It could be the ketoret, it could be anything. Now, in case you thought that we're going to take out the ketoret, the lavona, all those things that are inedible, because this is an Isur Achila, and they're not things that are edible anyway, well, no. This is going to even include, in other words, the third mention of it comes to include something additional. What must be the additional item? Inedible items. Now, that's obviously the rabbi's position, right? So this is Rabbi Yochanan, who holds that's what these three psukim are coming for. Now, Rabbi Shimon, now, according to Rabbi Shimon, things that are not eaten, you're not chayav mishum tuma, la tuyemai. What's this coming to include? So, because you can't say that third drasha, he doesn't think that's a problem. La tuye chataot pnimiyot. For him, they're coming for the chatat pnimit, which is any sin offering brought on the inner altar. Also, you're going to be chayav if you eat that meat and it's impure, or you're impure. Now, why does it need a special pasuk? Well, remember Rabbi Shimon's position about the chatat pnimit and pigul. Okay, we're going to connect the two Rabbi Shimons now. Sal kadat hachaminu, you might have thought, ho'il va'amar Rabbi Shimon kol she'ino al mizbeach hachitzon k'shlamim en chayavim alav mishum pigul. Remember what he says? Pigul is all learned out from a pasuk about shlamim. And chataot apnimiyot are completely different from shlamim, because everything's done on the inner altar, and all the meat is burned outside, and it's not really done on the outer altar, even though there are some things done, but for the most part, it's not done. The blood isn't sprinkled on the outer altar, and therefore it's not like shlamim, and therefore it has a laws of pigul. Now, since these three psukim about tuma also are by shlamim, it would be logical to say that Rabbi Shimon says, also in tuma, it's not relevant for the chataot pnimiyot. But that's why the drasha comes, right? You would have thought mishum tuma namelo lichayev. So because he doesn't have pigul, maybe he also thinks tuma isn't relevant for the chataot pnimiyot. Kamash malan. That's why we need the third pasuk for Rabbi Shimon teaches us specifically that it is relevant laws of tuma for anything sacrificed on the inner altar. Now, we're going to get to Rabbi Shimon and this machloka between him and the rabbis. Okay, we kind of got there in a side way right here because we were talking about the karet and why they have the three psukim. Now we're going to go to, there's a little bit of a lot of a complicated understanding of how this sugya connects with the previous one. Okay, I'm going to kind of put that issue aside because the commentaries really struggle with it and it's complicated. But some distinguish and say that's talking about the karet issue, and now we're moving to talk about malkut. Okay, and sometimes you could view the karet and lashes as connected because, and this is why it's a little bit complicated, because karet is if you are supposed to get karet, you also get lashes for it. But some people say we're actually talking about a lotase that doesn't have karet associated with it. It's very complicated how to figure this out, but let's just disconnect the two sugya for right now. And we're going to learn this sugya as if there's no connection necessarily to the previous. So, Numi Rabbi Shimon Machayev et Shedarko le'echol. Numi really means Omer, Amar Rabbi Shimon. It's a weird word. I don't know why they didn't quote the way it said in the Mishnah, because it's just a quote from the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon said that he's Machayev et Shedarko le'echol. You're only liable if it's something that's edible. You're not liable if it's inedible. So now we're going to have a whole machloket about the machloket. Okay, so here goes. Itmar. Rabbi Yochanan v'Rish Lakish, Rabbi Elazar v'Rabbi Yosi v'Rabbi Chanina. These are two pairs. Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish are one pair. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yosi v'Rabbi Chanina are another pair. Chad mihai zuzah v'chad mihai zuzah. What we're going to do is we're going to say, right, we often have this rabbi and that rabbi, but we don't know who says what. We're now going to have this pair and that pair. one from that pair and one from that pair. In Aramaic, zuzah is, it also means zuz, like money, type of coin, but it also means zug, a pair. So zuzah here means pair. So cha mehai zuzah, v'cha mehai zuzah. We're going to take one from this pair and one from that pair. We don't know which one, but one, either Rabbi Yochanan or Rish Lakish, agrees with either Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yosi, Chanina, and is on one side of this debate, and then the other two that are left, one from each pair, are on the other side of this debate. Okay, that's a side point. Now let's get into it. Chanamal, machloket b'tuma basal, aval b'tuma haguf divrei hakol eno loket. So we're talking about lashes here, like I said. And now the question is, so by the way, I just want to relate to something I said a minute ago, because I see someone ask a question I want to clarify. If you're supposed to get karet, the karet is by the hands of God, and malkot is by the court. So they actually claim, and we're going to learn all about this in Kritu when we get to a Homosechet about karet, but if you get lashes, that actually exempts you from the karet. In other words, you'll get your punishment in this world, and that will exempt you from your karet punishment. So it's not viewed as two punishments, because I see someone ask, isn't there something about not two punishments? First of all, the two punishments issue is the court. So this isn't a court, karet isn't court anyway, but it's generally understood that if you get the lashes, then you're actually exempt from karet. Obviously, no one really knows, because karet is a God-given punishment. But that's the claim. Okay, so now we say, machloket b'tum'at basal. When they have this machloket, edible, inedible, is it b'tum'at basal, or is it b'tum'at haguf, or is it both? Okay, what's the machloket about? Now, let's go through what these are. Tum'at basar means the sacrificial item. It doesn't have to be meat. It could be other things, but they're using that as a general term because the pasuk uses the term basal. Meat or sacrificial item gets impure, and a pure person eats it, or the person gets impure and eats the pure item, okay, the sacrificial item. You could also have both. Person's impure and the item's impure. It's also going to be forbidden. It doesn't, two wrongs don't make a right, okay? So let's talk about what is more intuitive that we're going to say that you get lashes for. So the pasuk, specifically where the lashes are, because the lashes come from this lo taseh, comes up in the pasuk Vayikra Zayin Yud Tet, and these are pasukim we've been reading the last few days. V'habasal asher yiga b'chol tamei, a meat, piece of meat that touches something tamei. So here clearly the topic is tumat basal. Lo yachel should not be eaten. There's the lo taseh. Okay, the karet comes up in the next pasuk, and if you remember, there we said tumato alav is specifically, that's the next pasuk, right? So let me just read this whole first pasuk. Habasar sheyiga b'chol tamei. So the meat that touches something tamei, lo yachel, cannot be eaten, but eish yisaref, should be burned in the fire. V'habasar kol torah yochal basal. And the meat should be eaten only by a pure person. And then it says, "Hanefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlamim asher laHashem v'tumato alav." And if a person eats meat from the zevach hashlamim, that's God, and the tuma is on him, we don't know, right? We have 4 explanations how we know that's actually talking about the person. Person is tamei, then he gets karet. So now the first pasuk, vehabasal, we're going to see, there's a drasha. Okay, Rashi quotes it, and later the Gemara is going to quote it, but it's from Chulin. That pasuk, vehabasal, there's an extra habasal, because it says habasar, sheyiga b'chol tamei lo yachel b'eish yisaref, and then it says vehabasar kol torah yochal basal. First of all, basar appears 3 times, and twice it says vehabasal. We don't know where this drasha comes from, which basal. Some people say it's not even the word basar, it's the vav, end. Why does it say end? And then it says end twice, vehabasar, so we don't even know which end. Somehow, from this pasuk, however, there's many different arguments about what, explanations how, but there's a drasha that says it an additional time to teach you, also eitzim, also livona, also things that are inedible. Okay? So, if you're going to say that inedible things, you're liable for them, it's going to be much more likely you're going to say it, in which case? In the tumat basar case, because the whole drasha about it is in the tumat basar case. So therefore, okay, that's what you have to remember in this whole thing. It's more intuitive to say that if the meat or the sacrificial item is impure, you're going to be liable even if the sacrificial item is inedible, is learned from the pasuk about sacrificial items and not about a person who's impure, who's eating a pure item. There it's less likely you're going to say it. So that's the logic here. So now let's read the 2 opinions. So Chanamar machloket b'tumat basal. So one said the whole machloket is tumat basar, and then you'd have to say that Rabbi Shimon doesn't hold by that drasha, it sounds like. And the rabbis do, because that's the drasha. It's in tuma pasal. Aval b'tuma aguf divrei hakol no lokeh. But if the person becomes impure and eats an inedible item, even the rabbis agree that there's no lashes. That's one. Chadamar k'machloka b'zo kach machloka b'zo. No, if you're going to argue in tuma pasal, which right, we're going to assume there's an argument there because the rabbis are going to say that's the drasha, and Rabbi Shimon is going to say there's no drasha, and I don't go with that drasha. Well, you're going to have the same machloket also in tumat aguf if the person's impure. Why? My time. Well, what's the reason? Well, kevan de krina beha basar sheyiga b'chol tamei, which is pasuk yutet, krina be b'tumato alav, which is pasuk kaf. In other words, these psukim are one right after the other. So what's true for one is going to be true for the other. We view this as a unit. They're both talking about the same ideas here. So if there's a lo taseh for that one, there's a lo taseh for that one. And if there's not for that one, there's not going to be for that one either. Now, and that's really with the focus on the rabbis, because we're going to say the rabbis are going to take this drasha of inedible items or chayav, and they're going to apply it also to the next pasuk as well. Whereas Rabbi Shimon doesn't think it applies at all. That's all one version of this machloket of between these two people. Rav Tavyumi matnei hachi. That was Rav Tavyumi's version of this machloket between the four of these rabbis. Rav Kahana matnei in a different way. He had a different version, and it went like this. Now it's the same logic, but he's going to move everything a level over. We're going to see what this means. They're both actually arguing about Rabbi Shimon, not about the rabbis like I just explained, but about Rabbi Shimon. Meaning, okay, let's start from the end here. Rabbi Shimon clearly holds that drasha. But that drasha, including inedible items, that drasha is about if the item is impure. Then, lo yochal, okay, you're going to have a lo taseh, you're going to get lashes for it. Everyone agrees with that, even Rabbi Shimon. The question is, does he apply it to the next pasuk as well? The rabbis do, Rabbi Shimon doesn't. Rabbi Shimon says, and that's where Rabbi Shimon says you're not chayav for inedible items, is really only if you yourself are impure and the object is pure. Then we're not going to obligate you for eating inedible items. And Chadamar, k'machloket b'zo, kach machloket b'zo. And the other pair said, no, it's the exact same machloket. And Amar Rava, mistabra kamanda amar k'machloket b'zo, kach machloket b'zo. Okay, so Rava says, it seems more logical to say, whatever the machloket is, it's in both cases. If they're going to argue in one, they're going to argue in both. My time, kevan lo karina be v'tumato alav v'nichrita. This is the flip of what we did before. Before we suggested, it's the same idea though, that if you're going to say it's true for pasuk yutet, right, the basal includes inedible items, then the second pasuk is going to go along with it. Now this logic is saying the same thing with the reverse order. If you're going to say it doesn't apply, inedible items are, right, if you're going to say, right, lo krina base, since it doesn't appear in the second pasuk, there's no drasha about inedible items there, then we're not going to learn it for tumat pasar either. Rabbi Shimon's going to say, neither case are we going to include inedible items. So the Gemara says, how can he say that though? If you're going to say, okay, so what he's basically saying is the pasuk tumato alav, which doesn't say anything about the word habasal, that's unnecessary, right? So there we have no reason to include inedible items. If we have no reason to include it there, then there's no reason to include it in the previous pasuk. To which the Gemara asks, but you can't just say he ignores there's a drasha in the pasuk before. This really isn't so logical to say what's true for kaf is true for yutet, because yutet has its own drasha, including lavona. So how can Rabbi Shimon say, what he's basically saying in this machloket is, you don't get lashes if you eat inedible items? To which the Gemara answers, lipsula ba'alma. That drasha is a rabbinic drasha. It's what we call an asmachta ba'alma. It's basically saying the rabbis said, don't eat these, even inedible items that become impure. Okay? Even if they're inedible, don't eat them. But you're not going to get lashes for them because it's only rabbinic. You only get lashes for a prohibition that's Torah law. So Rabbi Shimon, now we started off thinking that Rabbi Shimon didn't hold that drasha. Now we're going to say, no, Rabbi Shimon holds the drasha. He just thinks the drasha is just a rabbinic law. So you're not going to get lashes for it, okay? You shouldn't do it. You shouldn't eat it. If the wood that you were going to use to burn on the altar becomes tameh, so don't eat it. But if you eat it, you're not going to be liable. So I see you're asking, Becky, how do you eat something tamei, right? It's a great question. It's something inedible, right? I mean, this is kind of an unrealistic sugya, okay? It's very theoretical. I mean, people do put things in their mouths and eat things that are inedible sometimes. So, whatever. But it's more of a theoretical argument, which reminds me, by the way, talking about theoretical arguments and questions, we have Rabbi Yirmiyah this week, and I forgot to mention that Shuli Mishkan's article was all about Rabbi Yirmiyah and one of our favorite characters who loves to ask these crazy questions. So anyway, you can read that if you haven't read it yet. But the main thing here is that we're having, like you said, a theoretical argument about whether inedible items are or are not. And we have this big debate about what exact case were they arguing. We learned that the whole thing comes from this vehabasal, and therefore it's more intuitive to say that the rabbis would specifically be talking about the basar, not necessarily about also if someone's impure and eats pure sacrificial items that are inedible. But it's not clear. Is the debate across the board? Is it just one, not the other? Rava definitely seemed to say the machloket seems to be across the board. And also Rabbi Shimon, right? Does he maybe agree in that case because of that drasha, right? Rava thinks not in the end, but there was a zug that thought so. So we had, again, a debate between 2 and 2, and then a debate about what the debate was between the 2 and the 2. So it was a debate within a debate. Okay, before we get to the next Mishna, I want to do a bit of a summary of today's daf, and really, we're about to kind of close our topic of machshava. We're about to start Ezu Mukoman Shel Zevachim, which we're going to start tomorrow, which are like the basics of korbanot, which korban goes where, what are the different details, what's different, kachum kalim. Good time, by the way, to if you didn't listen to Alana's Stein-Hain shir on kachum kalim, which was a week or two ago, I don't remember, but it's a good time to listen because we're going to start talking about the distinctions. And she has a new shir going up today about the mizbeach, also in preparation for the next chapter. About the I think the outer altar. She said it was about. I didn't have a chance to listen yet. So what we did today so far, we did the blood. We said, okay, the blood. How do we know blood is an exception to the rule? There's no notar tummy for eating the blood. We brought 3 psukim from Me'ila and then said, oh, really? There's 3 because it's for Me'ila, notar, and chum, and that's how we got our halakha. Then we got into another place where there's 3, kind of connected to our topic, but was really there because of the 3. And what do we learn from those 3? And we had the difference between the rabbis and Rabbi Shimon, because the rabbis included one inedible, and then Rabbi Shimon didn't agree with that, so he had to include something else, the chatot pnimiyot. And then we got to this machloka between them and exactly what case are they debating. Now we get to really the Mishna that theoretically you might have thought this should be the Mishna that started off the Masechet, because we started off our Masechet with what if you do it shelo lishma. And then we got into the Gemara, got into this whole discussion. What's lishma? This is the Mishnah that says, what is lishma? Right? Our Masechet starts out with what are all the mess-ups you could do without telling us what you're supposed to do ideally. Now, this happens in a lot of Masechtot. I'll give you 2 quick examples. Sukkah starts off with if it's too tall or too short, right? Sukkah gvoha slima ama is disqualified. And less than 10 tefachim, disqualified. Again, it starts off with the disqualifications only at the very end, which is exactly what we have here. The very end of that section, before it gets to the arba minim, does it start talking about 7 days you should make your sukkah keva, you should make your bayit arai, you should make your sukkah your permanent place for those 7 days, and your house, the temporary place where you are. And then it talks about if it rains on sukkahs, it's like God spilling a glass of wine that you brought him in your face. And the idea of, the philosophy behind, it doesn't really talk about why we're sitting in the sukkah, which also should have maybe done that, but about the importance of the mitzvah of sukkah and what the sukkah is doing and the connection between you and God. Well, similar thing happens here, okay? There's other examples, but I'm going to stop here because we don't have a lot of time. L'shem shisha dvarim hazevach nizbach. Supposed to sacrifice a sacrifice for 6 purposes. L'shem zevach should be, now this seems to say, when you're slaughtering, because it's talking about zevach, some people say this doesn't just mean slaughtering, it means slaughtering, collecting the blood, right? All the 4 main avodot, you have to have this in mind, okay? And in mind could even be expressing. L'shem zevach, what sacrifice you're doing it for. L'shem zovach, which person you're doing this for. L'shem Hashem, the name of God, okay? You're doing the sacrifice for God. L'shem ishim, for the sake of fire, which we're going to talk about soon what this means. L'shem reach, for the sake of a smell. And l'shem nichach, for the sake of being accepted by God. Okay, the ishim, reach, and nichach all come from ishe, reach, nichach, la'Hashem, which we know from davening, right? That's what we talk about, all sacrifices. It's in ishe, reach, nichach, la'Hashem. It's a pasuk that appears a lot. Okay, so it's the ishe, the ishim, reach, and nichach. So we'll talk about this soon. Hachatat v'hasham l'shem chet. So there's 6, but in a chatat and an asham, because for a particular sin, you also have to have in mind the particular sin. Now, we don't know really who is supposed to have in mind right now. Tina, it's exactly your question. Is it referring to the Kohen or to the individual, the owner of the korban? We don't know right now. Sounds like it's the Kohen or the one who's doing the slaughtering, the one who's doing the action. It sounds that way. In a minute, I'm going to read you this Mishnah a little differently according to the Rambam in his Perush Mishnah. But the simple reading, the way the Gemara, it seems like that's what it's going to be saying. We're going to get into a machloket about who the person is. Okay, we're going to get to that tomorrow. Okay, but seems like, and the Gemara is going to think that we're talking really about the Kohen, comes from, although it leaves one line in the Mishnah very unclear if you go with that. Amar Rabbi Yosi, af misha lo haya b'libo l'shem acham mikol elu kasher. Even if you didn't have in mind any of these, it's kasher. How do we know? Shel hu t'nai beiting, she'en ha'machshava holechet ela achar ha'oved. Okay, these are two things that really seem a little unconnected. It's a t'nai beiting, okay, that, what's a t'nai beiting? It's a stipulation of the court that what? So, if you don't know what this means, Rashi helps us, but he goes back to Dav Bet Amud Bet. And the Gemara, in a discussion about what if you did a Zevach Bistam without any machshava at all, it's kasher. Where do we get it from? And then one of the sources they bring is this, that Amar Rabbi Yosi, even if you didn't have any intent at all, it's kasher, because T'nai Beitin. Now, the way they explain this T'nai Beitin is, Antnu beitin de lo lema lishmo. The beitin institute that you shouldn't do it lishmo. And basically what the Gemara is going to say, right, you shouldn't do it for any intent at all. And then they're going to say, well, then obviously there's no way if zevach that's done stam is not kasher, there's no way the court would say this is how you should do it. Now, why did the court do it? That's what's more interesting, is because they said that dilma ate lememar shelo lishmo. People make mistakes. So if they say the name of the zevach, you might say the wrong thing, and then you'll ruin the korban. Or say the name of the person, you might get confused. Better not to say anything, and just go with a stam korban, and that will be kasher. And maybe, he says, the machshava follows the person who's doing the avoda. And that's what we've been saying the whole time. It's the Kohen, or it's the one who's sacrificing. They're the one with the people machshava. Tomorrow, we're finally going to see the opinion of someone that I've mentioned a few times, who says, no, that's not the case. But it seems like our Mishnah is all really in accordance with that. But his point is, since it's someone who's not, it's not their actual korban, it's more likely they're going to make mistakes, so better not to say anything. Okay, so Tanakama says you have to say these 6 things. It sounds like you have to, although the Gemara and Daf Bet Amud Bet did say you don't really have to, maybe ideally, but you don't have to. And then Rabbi Yosi came and said, actually you shouldn't, because you might make mistakes, better not to say anything. But the Rambam has a totally different interpretation of this Mishnah, and I can't not tell it to you because I just think it's very interesting. So the Rambam basically reads this Mishnah differently. He says the machloka between the rabbis and Rabbi Yosi is who's doing the machshava. And what the rabbis are saying is the person who does the korban, who's their korban, not the one doing it, but the one whose korban it is, has to be thinking while his korban or her korban is being brought, has to think about these 6 items. And then Rabbi Yosi says, even if you don't have intent, it's fine, because the t'nai beitin is that it goes, or it's a good question what he means by the t'nai beitin here, but t'nai beitin hu she'ein choshishim ela l'machshevet ha'oved bilvad. The t'nai beitin is that we only go by the person doing the avoda. The machshava follows the oved, and not the shochet. And not the owner of the korban. Okay? And then the machloket in the Mishnah is specifically that topic. So it's a very different way of understanding the Mishnah. The Bavli doesn't go with the Rambam, okay? But, okay. So Becky, your question is exactly what I was saying. It sounds like all 6 are necessary according to the rabbis, but the sugya in Daf Bet Amud Bet seemed to say no. You could just do it stama and it's fine. And it could be because we assume stama means you're doing it for these 6 reasons. So now let's talk about these 6 reasons. So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Ola l'shem ola. If you're doing korban ola, so what does it mean l'shem hazevach? You say l'shem ola for the purpose of an ola. Lafuk yeshem shlamim delo, because it won't work if you do it l'shem shlamim. Remember, the korban won't be disqualified, but you won't get your obligation fulfilled. You'll have to bring a new korban, right? As opposed to the chatat, which we know is disqualified, or the pesach. Ishe l'shem ishim. Okay, what's that? For the sake of fire, obviously you're putting it on the altar, you're going to burn it. Well, lafuke kevava dilo. We don't want like a piece of, a steak that's medium done, okay? We're putting it on the fire not to roast the meat. We're putting it on the fire to burn it completely. That's a different thing than, creating a piece of roasted meat. Reach, l'shem reach. What does this come? Okay, obviously it's going to have a nice smell when you put meat, right? How often do you walk out of your house and smell, oh, someone's barbecuing, right? You can smell it from far away. Well, afuke ivarim shetzlaan ve'elan dilo. If you take meat and you cook it in your house and then you stick it on the barbecue after, once it's already cooked, it's not going to smell very well. So you can't roast it inside and put it, roast it somewhere else and then put it on the altar. Ta'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, and here they just quote Rav Yehuda saying this in the name of Rav, ivarim shetzlaan ve'elan ein b'hem mishum reach. It won't have smell, the aroma. Nichach l'shem ruach. The God will accept it. Okay, that's what you're looking for. La Hashem, this is a little bit strange that they're explaining this, l'shem misha amar v'haya olam. Okay, you have to say it for the name of the one who said the world, right, who created the world. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Chatat sheshachata l'shem ola psula, l'shem chulin kshecha. So now, we talked about stam. If you do it for nothing, right, it's okay. What if you do it l'shem chulin? I'm slaughtering the animal in the temple and I say, I'm doing this for the sake of chol, okay, for a non-sacred korban. So, like for barbecuing my own meat or something. While you're in the temple slaughtering this korban. So, if you do it l'shem ola, it's psula, okay, a chatat, because a chatat that you do l'shem ola is disqualified. But if you do it l'shem chulin, it actually works. Okay, this is like a min bimino, min she'eno bimino. If it's the same type, it's actually much worse. Because you're doing it as a korban and the wrong korban. But if you're saying l'shem chulin, it doesn't really mean anything. Because you're in the temple, you're slaughtering it to put on the altar. Even if you say l'shem chulin, maybe we think you don't really mean it. It's a good question why this doesn't disqualify. But I'm a Rabbi Elazar, my time at the Rav. He's not going to really give us the reason. He's going to say, where does he get it from the pasuk? He reads this pasuk, "V'lo yechalalu et kodshei b'nei Yisrael, kodashim mechalalim kodashim ve'en chulin mechalalim kodashim." He reads "lo yechalalu et kodshei" as you won't have chulin messing up kodshim. If you do it l'shem chulin, it won't mess up your korban. Mativ Rabba, Rabba says, wait a minute, I'm Rabbi Yosi. Our Mishna seems to raise a problem with this. Rabbi Yosi says, Av mi shelo haya b'libo l'shem acham mikol elu kasher, shu t'nai beitim. Tama shelo haya b'libo klal. It sounds like if you don't have any of these in mind, it's fine. But that seems to imply if you had in your mind something else that wasn't exactly right, wouldn't be good, right? So then he says, Ha haya b'libo l'shem chulin, it should be pasul. So wouldn't you infer that? So Amar le'abai, with this will end. Dilma lo haya klal kasher umiratzeh. Maybe what he meant to say was, if you didn't do any thought, it's kasher and you get atonement. It's completely perfect. Ha haya b'libo l'shem chulin kasher ve'eno miratzeh. This brings us back to the first Mishnah. You could have a case where the korban's kosher, you can still do the process, but it doesn't work for you. So maybe if you do it l'shem chulin, we won't disqualify it. You could still go ahead and sacrifice it, but maybe the inference from Rabbi Yosi is, but it's not miratzeh. It just doesn't fulfill your obligation. But it's still a kosher korban. And that could explain, against that the contradiction, what Rav said, that l'shem chulin kshera, but ain't no miratzeh. And therefore, we don't necessarily have a difficulty with him. We're going to stop here and continue with this topic tomorrow, finish up our chapter, and start Ezu Mukaman Shel Zevachim. So what we did here is the 6 things, or possibly 7 in the Chatat and the Asham. I mean, it is 7 in the Chatat and the Asham. And this machloka between him and Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yosi seems like Tanakama is saying you should do this, at least ideally, because it seems from the Gemara. You don't have to, though. But you should do it ideally. And Rabbi Yosi says you shouldn't do it ideally because if you do it, you might mess up. And better, the Kohen or the one slaughtering doesn't mess up someone else's korban, so let's avoid it. Okay, the Tanai Beitin kind of overrules that importance of doing it according to him. We explained what the 6 items were, and then we talked about this issue of l'shem chulin, which is kind of an in-between of l'shem, the wrong korban, and in between that and l'shem nothing, right, where you say nothing, where it definitely works. And then he says even l'shem chulin works, and then we saw, well, maybe it works, but it doesn't fulfill the obligation, right? That at least was a suggestion. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.